Hi there. Children, you can replace. Old people, a waste of space. A burden on the pension fund. From these folk, you can turn your face. But the wheels of industry must keep rolling. I can think of a lot of some politicians who secretly might actually agree with that statement, brutal as it sounds. Because if this coronavirus panic keeps going, the industry, the wheels industry, will grind to a halt, and people won't buy anything or do anything, which will be bad for business. And I'm not going to sort of name those politicians. I mean, probably you can figure out who I'm referring to. But it's an interesting point because if the wheels of industry, given that we live in a capitalist society, if worldwide and globalist, if they grind to a halt, then a lot more people could suffer and even die. A lot more people than could suffer and die as a result of the coronavirus. And so, therefore, it becomes a utilitarian argument. And in case you don't know, utilitarian morality is that action is good so long as it maximizes the happiness of the greatest number. And maximizes the happiness means also promotes the well-being of the greatest number, and indeed the survival of the greatest number. So you do have to let certain groups of people go if they are vulnerable and susceptible to certain things. And so this coronavirus, it makes children and old people vulnerable, and also makes a great deal many people who are actually neither old nor children vulnerable, of course. People that suffer from asthma and things like that. Well, they are vulnerable to the coronavirus. Um, but against that is the danger that the panic and the restrictions on life will affect the economies of the world and actually produce more suffering than reduce it. So what I'm saying is that some politicians might just say, well, why don't we just allow coronavirus to become endemic rather than pandemic? And then it's just like one more virus that we have to cope with seasonally or periodically or sporadically. And most people will have the virus in a very mild form, gain an immunity to it, and the only people that will die is perhaps 80 or 90% of those people who have had their lives anyway, to put it rather bluntly and brutally. And as it says in the mantra, babies can be replaced. You just have more children. That's all you do with that. Um, but of course, I know that when Boris Johnson makes his speech to the House today, he will probably try to create a kind of balanced policy between outright panic and restricting and collapsing the wheels of industry, trying to avoid that, whilst at the same time trying to contain the virus. So it's pretty obvious that he will say, well, at gatherings, travellings, and you could certainly restrict those for a bit, and you could also isolate communities that have a large population of old people, such as old people's homes and areas where people sheltered housing and areas and things like that. And you can quarantine those places, and you can make sure that the virus doesn't get in there. But and you can also obviously quarantine maternity wings of hospitals and other and close down creches and kindergartens and things like that, and nursery schools. So there's and of course, the people that are buying the tissue, toilet papers and gloves and sanitizers, and sanitary gels, sanitizing gels, obviously they're the people that want to keep going to work, but they don't want to spread the virus at work, which is fair enough, because on one hand you don't want to spread the virus, but on the other hand you still want to keep going to work, not just for your own, in order to keep the mortgage payments up, but because you also don't want everything just to come to a grinding halt as a result of this virus. So I think a lot of people obviously are ahead of the game and thinking about this really. But I mean, I think the danger is it's a bit like, well, it's not really similar at all. Actually, it's on a different scale to the problem of global warming. But this is the argument Donald Trump produces. It has, what's the use in restricting carbon? What in restricting the carbon footprint if it's going to affect the economies of the world? Because you're actually, going to create more suffering by once again ruining the chances of the economies of the world from recovering from 2008 through restriction. It's better not to worry about carbon taxes, but to use taxes, if any, to ameliorate the symptoms of global warming, rather than sort of rather than restricting the economy. You allow the economy to blossom. And if the economy of the world is causing global warming, if it is, then it's better to ameliorate the symptoms of global warming through taxation rather than having a carbon tax, for example, which restricts the economies of the world and the economies of the West in particular. But of course, a lot of people say this is a simplistic argument and an argument which is short-termist and has no long-term merit. And of course, unlike the coronavirus is definitely there in front of our eyes, whereas global warming maybe won't happen. And certainly may not be caused by mankind. It may be a natural phenomenon. So again, it's slightly different. Well, there are very different scenarios going on here. But in a way, it's sort of the same with environmental protection. Is it worth, protecting the environment from commerce? If commerce can be made to pay to clear up the environmental damage that it causes, unwittingly causes, by being what it is, sort of thing. So, again, it's a balancing. You have to balance keeping keeping industry alive, keeping commerce alive, keeping economies rolling around. You have to balance that with protecting the environment, and even now with protecting the populace. Isn't it better, to just you have to keep balancing these two forces, if you like. A concern for the environment, a concern for public health versus keeping the wheels of industry turning, and not burdening industry, not burdening businesses with unnecessary bureaucracy and taxation and regulations and rules and things like that. And of course, this is the Conservative, the Republican point of view, as you probably well know. But in this case, despite all the panics, despite all the restrictions, it may be that coronavirus does become endemic to the world's population, which will simply mean, in terms of statistics, that the mortality rate amongst old people will increase a lot. And the mortality rate with children and babies might increase as well, which is all very well for statistics to express. But of course, for example, in Ireland there are 5 million people, and there could be 80,000 more people die within the next 18 months, and that's a lot of people to die within a community of 5 million. And 1.9 million people will get the coronavirus, apparently, and just quite a lot of people within a community of 5 million people. Now, of course, in America, the population of 5 million is probably a town to you Americans. It's probably the size of an average town, but never mind a whole country or a whole state. Well, I suppose there are a couple of states. Well, I'm thinking at least one state which might have only 5 million people in it. And obviously, if coronavirus becomes endemic, a lot of people amongst the 5 million people are going to die. 80,000 people is a lot of people to bury. Do you know what I mean? And other human things, like people won't be able to go to the funerals as well. So I'm thinking in terms of kindness coming into and compassion and humanity. That statement up there is pretty much lacking in humanity. And of course, we hope that it doesn't come to that. We hope that through quarantine measures and certain restrictions and restriction on travel and gatherings, that statement is an extreme statement, and it won't apply. Things will calm down, and and a certain amount of coronavirus might, to an extent, become endemic, but not on a sort of scale where we just sort of choose. If we choose to do nothing, it'll just become endemic. And if we choose to go down the route of draconian restrictions, then it might, as I say, it might affect the economies of the world. Of course, somebody said to me, it affects pretty much the economies of the world equally. So it isn't like, one country or one block of countries is going to have an economic advantage over others as a result of coronavirus. So in a sense, it might be better to look at it from a humanitarian point of view than from an economic point of view. In any case, you see, and economics can always, it comes up and down. Things go down in the stock market, but they come back up, and no one takes any notice. But when a person dies, they're never coming back, sort of thing. But in order to make this presentation a spiritual presentation and not just about politics and disease, I was thinking, in the days of Jesus, when Jesus walked the earth, of course, people walked very much with the angel of death. And a lot of people survived, but a lot of people didn't survive. And of course, there were no antibiotics of any kind. If you cut your finger, you could die after 3 months of agony through infection, and there was nothing anyone could do for you. And there were lots of, obviously lots of endemic diseases like polio and cholera and typhoid and leprosy and all these diseases and plague were rampant, ravaged the land and ravaged the population of the earth. I mean, to such an extent that you think, how can anybody have actually survived? But people were used to death. They were used to having 10 children and losing 8 of them. Do you know what I mean? Which is horrific to think about, but that's what life was like. And Jesus walked with people, with the angel of death, very much. And of course, the angel of death walked about on earth, pretty much an unstoppable force in terms of mass death until right up to the 1950s, really. Before that, you know, people could die in their thousands through various diseases which can now be treated. So what we're looking at now is a disease which cannot be treated at the moment. But of course, people hope that a vaccine will be developed in a couple of years' time. A safe vaccine will be developed, of course. And I say safe because a lot of people don't even think vaccines are safe. So a great deal of people won't even bother having the vaccine for the coronavirus because they think it will do more damage than not. But that's another story. And the thing is that Jesus walked with people, with the angel of death, very much walking in the countryside with him, and he said things like, "Be kind to a stranger, help people that you don't know, cleanse yourself of evil thoughts rather than try and go around and cleanse other people. Look to your own house rather than other people's house. Look to your own spiritual development rather than making other people fit your idea of spiritual perfection," and many other things that he said. Wise sayings that are in the Gospels and in the Gnostic Gospels, and wise symbolic language that he used, and all this, despite all the horrors that were going on around him, and then of course, and the starvation and the malnutrition, which of course, is very much makes diseases worse. Of course, bad sanitation, malnutrition. There can be a lot of diseases going around, but if you have a good immune system due to a good diet, due to good sanitation, good living conditions, then you can actually withstand a lot of diseases that used to kill people by the cartload in right up till the 1950s. Do you know what I mean? So I think that we have to look at death in the face, but Jesus and Jesus' sayings and Jesus' wisdom and the wisdom of all spiritual leaders and spiritual masters and saints, they walk with us despite the angel of death being about, and that we should take more notice of spiritual spiritual masters and spiritual saints and people who have spiritual things to say, rather than take notice of panic and take notice of rumors of war and rumors of evil and death, because the angel of death walks with us anyway, is about the place, will never go away on this dimension, so that we should fill our minds with spiritual thoughts. Rather than panicking about the world of the demiurge, which is as it is. I mean, look at the world. Everything is trying to kill us and trying to kill you in one way or another, or consume you in one way or another. And it's how we react to these situations. It's important if we react with kindness and solidarity rather than selfishness and violence and aggression. What does the word panic boil down to? Pan, a fearsome, violent, mad, insane god called Pan, representing nature, red in tooth and claw, and drunkenness and selfishness and violence and war and aggression. This is what Pan represents, a sort of defiling pagan force, as it were, in the world. And panic obviously comes from that. And pandemic, I suppose. I mean, Pan is all. But is Pan all? Or is there something other and something greater than Pan? And Gnostics believe that there is. And Gnostics believe there is. And we should listen and read the spiritual texts and scriptures rather than take any notice of what spews out at Twitter and Facebook and the TV screen. So that's my kind of quasi-spiritual presentation. I say quasi because I myself have a great deal of difficulty from not panicking, because I'm a rather neurotic, excitable person. And I myself have to, look at this from a spiritual point of view, rather than from a survival point of view or survivalist point of view, because then I go into fear, and then I go into aggression, depression, and all the other things, ions, begin to take over, and I become stressed. When there's probably no need to be, because nothing really has changed. It's same as. But in the West, we're just not used to the angel of death being so visible, I suppose, also publicized, as it were. But Jesus was around when death was prevalent, and Jesus is still around, and nothing has changed about this world, and nothing has changed about spirituality. I am not this world. I am not this death. I am not this, not these feelings. I'm not these thoughts. I am not this panic. I am not Twitter. I am not Facebook. I am that I am. And so I just present this as not as a comforting thing for you, but as a statement of reality, because the spiritual is more real than the reality that we see around us, and spirituality is much more real than any virus could possibly be.